And I was saying that I think that Jung's thought is extraordinarily important for the time we're living through, because he also lived through this period of authoritarianism, fascism, during the 1930s, and he was the first person really to draw attention to the shadow, and the collective shadow, and the projection of the shadow, particularly on enemy leaders. And we're seeing this in spades, and we've seen it, all over the Middle East, for instance, since 2003. And so there's so much to learn, and not only on the collective level, but also on the individual level in terms of individuation. And so I'm very pleased that Jeanette's going to be with us this evening. And her question here is, what is seeking to emerge into visible life? And can we co-create with it to shape our future consciously? And she has done training with other people, including Stan Groff, who's an honorary member. And she's a retired palliative care social worker, so she's seen a few things. So, Jeanette, over to you.
Thank you. I'll just launch straight in, shall I? Let me just set up the share here. Right.
Yeah.
Can you all see that okay?
Good so far.
Can you see this slide?
Yes.
I can't hear you.
We can see the slide.
Okay, brilliant, brilliant. Okay, well, thank you very much for inviting me to speak. And it's lovely to see so many of you here. So it's hard not to feel that something is broken at a very deep level when we see the destruction in our world. We can feel distressed and powerless, and we may even stop watching because it just hurts too much to witness it. So we need something to help us hold what we're living through and to find a way forward. And a central aspect of that is our way of knowing. Now, a number of people have already spoken about gnosis, so I'm not going to go into that here, but it does feel like the Gnostic approach underpins the various aspects of my talk. So for those of you who didn't hear the earlier talks, Gnosis is a body of ancient knowledge and wisdom, which values insights that come to us intuitively in an embodied and relational way, as opposed to through objective reasoning. And this knowledge is potentially available to everyone. By developing our ability to sense it, we can all have this direct inner experience. So Carl Jung gave us one framework which can help us hold our experience of living in today's world. In The Undiscovered Self, he considers dangerous social developments very much like those we're facing today. People are losing a sense of self, they're abdicating personal responsibility, and they're getting swept up in mass movements. We can see a rise of authoritarianism and a growing power of the state. Scientism and dogmatic religion are hugely influential, and we're developing technologies that could very well destroy us. So Jung says we need to look at our inner world to help us address these issues. Our inner world and the outer are related. The physical and our psyche reflect one another because they're ultimately one thing. So to come through the huge personal and collective challenges we face, we need to engage with what he calls individuation. We need to develop a deeper self-knowledge and a sense of wholeness and of who we authentically are. We need to recognize the reality and impact of our psyche, and we need to find a felt connection to something larger than our limited ego consciousness. And expanded states of consciousness can support the individuation process because they immerse us in a mythical, symbolic world of the unconscious. And that way of knowing engages both our head and heart, because psyche speaks to us symbolically and in embodied ways. Now, I'm not an expert on Jung. I'm just going to share some of my personal journey, which involved some of these states and images, and how I've tried to make sense of them. And as part of that, I'm going to ask with Jung, as we follow the call and open the door to that depth of the psyche, is there something that wants to step over into visible life to take concrete shape? As we listen to our depth, is something listening back from the other side? For me, this journey brings 4 areas together: psychedelics, kundalini, trauma, and the importance of the feminine and of heart-based ways of knowing. I've drawn mostly on Jungian psychology and the law of 3, and I'll explain what that is in a minute, and the systemic thinking of Cynthia Bourgeault and Irvin Laszlo. First, to give a little bit of context, I'll start with some key experiences in my life. And I'm not going to go through this in any depth. It's just to give you a flavor of the main points. I had some, as an infant, I had some early operations which led to some anxious attachment patterns. I always had a need to know that there was something more than material reality. I did counseling and social work training. And then in 97, I had my first experience of something called holotropic breathwork, which is a technique developed by Stan and Christina Groff, by which you use breath and driving music to enter non-ordinary states of consciousness, very similar to those you can get into through use of psychedelics. This, I think, was the first real breakthrough for me into experiencing something beyond material reality, and also my first experience of something that was like a kundalini type energy. I was so bowled over by this that I decided to train with Stan Groff and did the holotropic breathwork training, and then had a year out in America where I did more intensive meditation and work with psychedelics, because Stan speaks of with such love of his research into therapeutic application of psychedelics in his lectures. So in the course of all of that, I had some really big experiences, some of which I'll tell you about. But in 1999, I had to come back home. My money had run out and I had to get back to work, which at that time was mental health advocacy and social work in an acute adult mental health team. And to do that work, I needed fairly strong ego boundaries. So I stopped doing any kind of practices that got me into deeper layers of the psyche. The only thing that still spontaneously happened was periodically this kundalini-like energy that would come at night mostly. And sometimes that was triggered by external experiences, like when a colleague and friend of mine took his own life, that triggered an episode of the energy. But very often I didn't know why it had come. So after 2016, I resumed holotropic breathwork. I did some work with psychedelics. And then after I retired in 2021, I did the Institute of Psychedelic Therapy training in psychedelic assisted therapy. During the 2 years of that training, the energy was more or less continuously active at night. Then it continued some time after that, and I started an MSc with the Aleph Trust in about a year ago, last year. And very curiously, the energy stopped. That may be totally coincidental, I don't know, but it's interesting. I realized by January that I'd taken on far too much and I gave up the MSc. And recently I had another high dose psilocybin session, which again was a big heart opening experience. And I don't know what will come next. So for me, expanded states have come through holotropic breathwork, meditation, psychedelics, and kundalini-like energies. And those have kind of furthered some kind of inner process or spiritual emergence, an opening to experiences beyond my regular awareness that gave glimpses of the depths of the psyche, and sometimes a kind of deep felt connection. And these experiences were light and beautiful, but also sometimes dark and absolutely terrifying. And I can't will these openings to happen. I can inwardly reach out, but I need something to meet me. And sometimes that just isn't there or not in the same way. So there have been long periods of there not being any openings at all, and times of confusion and sometimes intense fear. It spurred a drive for me to understand what might be going on and a deep longing for that connection to something bigger than myself. So, for the purposes of this talk, I want to focus on a couple of questions. How can we understand what goes on in these states? And does the theory actually help me understand my own experiences? Is it useful? Are there any dangers in opening up to this process? And is something similar happening with humanity as a whole? So, how can we understand these states? Whatever goes on, the immediate raw experience is very hard to put into words, and maybe our minds can't actually fully capture it. People have talked about it in different ways, such as to say that it has a dynamic, enlivening, numinous quality, or that it involves a sense of being filled or held by something, a kind of infusion or possession. And for me, some of these experiences have involved encounters with what seemed like independent beings or centers of consciousness. And beyond that, something that feels like a numinous divine force or presence. For me, these experiences seem to fall into two interpenetrating dimensions, like two sides of a coin. You can't really separate them out, both with a strong emotional component. So on the one hand, there is an energetic, embodied physical dimension, and on the other, a more dynamic, mental, visual one. So Jung speaks about the embodied, physical, energetic side of the process in a seminar in 1932, where he talks about kundalini. Kundalini Shakti, he says, is an autonomous archetypal process which is experienced as a direct embodied awareness of an impersonal, independent dimension of being, of non-ego or self. The system of Tantra is a symbolic theory of the psyche which aligns with what he called the individuation process, which is the integration of conscious and unconscious parts of ourselves so that we develop a unique identity apart from the crowd in conscious relation to the self. In his book, Answer to Job, he connects Kundalini Shakti with Sophia, the eternal feminine principle, a kind of force of creation or manifestation in material form. Others have spoken of Kundalini as a lived experience of powerful, numinous, subtle spiritual energy that comes from a surrender to a deep inner process. It's been written about extensively in ancient Hindu and Buddhist tantric texts, but it's really a cross-cultural phenomenon, and it seems to be increasingly experienced by Westerners, although we may be experiencing it in a slightly different way from the Eastern descriptions. And there is a debate about whether we should really call what we're experiencing Kundalini, because that term is very much historically and culturally located. But I'm going to call it that because I don't know what else to call it. So Dr. Lee Sanella and others have done research into the phenomena of Kundalini. People describe a sense of heat and or cold, internal light or sounds, varying amounts of pain throughout the body, emotional, mental, and thought disruptions, detachment and dissociated cognitive states, and out-of-body experiences. My experience has included intense, challenging energetic states, which were also ecstatic and deeply satisfying, a sense of being seized by an overwhelmingly powerful, deeply feminine, intelligent energy that was streaming or radiating through me, inward shaking, changing heart rhythms, heat, physical pain, involuntary physical movements, straining, changes in breathing, vocalizations, and powerful emotional and dreamlike inner processes and emotional release. So we don't know if Carl Jung experienced Kundalini himself, but he may well have done. He writes, I stagger drunk with fire. I drank fire in this night. I rose up drunk from the sun with a burning countenance, and my head is ablaze. Give me your hand, a human hand, so that you can hold me to the earth with it. For whirling veins of fire swoop me up, and exultant longing tears me towards the zenith. So talking about such experiences, Jung says, the numinosum is a dynamic existence or effect not caused by an act of will. It seizes and controls the human subject, which is its victim. It is perfectly possible psychologically for the unconscious or an archetype to take complete possession of a man and to determine his fate. Talking about the mental dimension of the experience, Jung says it can take the form of inner visions, figures, or entities. Jung says, I learned to take seriously every unknown wanderer who personally inhabits the inner world, since they are real because they're effectual. And it begs the question, do we also have an impact on what we encounter? And I would say from reading the Red Book that it really implies that we do. So how can we make sense of such inner visions and wanderers? Jung says about the psyche, and this diagram comes from a book by Bernardo Kastrup about Jung's metaphysics. Jung says about the psyche that our ego and ego consciousness, or a small I, is that part of the wider psyche that we identify with and over which we have some control. So he calls that the subjective psyche. And that's surrounded by the unconscious or the objective psyche, that contains the personal unconscious and the much larger, maybe infinite collective unconscious, the universal, unchanging, archetypal foundation of the psyche. So psyche really is one continuity, an intrinsic essence underlying all existence. So matter, ego consciousness, and spirit shade into each other like different degrees or states of the same thing. Like water can be ice, it can be fluid, and it can be vapor. The physical world is essentially psychic. Psyche is independent of us and objective from the ego's point of view. We can only know about the psyche through direct personal experience of it, by paying attention to our inner experiences and our projections onto the outer world. And our ego consciousness is influenced in one way by the instincts, compulsive drives, and in another way by the spirit, which Jung, among other ways, talks about in the form of daimons. So Bernardo Kastrup, in his reflections on Jung, calls what Jung calls psyche cosmic consciousness. And he says all living organisms, so that includes us, are actually dissociated alters of cosmic consciousness, like we have dissociated identity disorder, and we can have more personalities within ourselves. That apparently seems to be mirrored in cosmic consciousness. And Jung's daimons are autonomous, dissociated aspects of the collective unconscious as well, so just like us. And he agrees with Jung that for better or for worse, we can yield control or be taken over by these autonomous psychic forces. So psychic forces are a force of consciousness with their own agenda. The Greek word daimon expresses a determining power which comes upon man from the outside, like providence or fate, though the ethical decision is left to man, says Jung. So we always have a choice about how we relate or respond to what comes towards us. The energy underlying conscious psychic life is pre-existent to it. At first, it's unconscious, and then as it approaches consciousness, it appears projected in figures like gods, daimons, and so on, whose numen seems to be the vital source of energy. And as these figures fade, the ego seems to come into possession of this source of energy. And on the one hand, the ego seeks to seize this energy, to possess it, and on the other hand, it is possessed by it. The daimon would like to inflame you to embrace their work, which is not yours, and you believe that it is you and that it is your work. So just to put these three alongside each other, because we're going to build on these concepts. So according to Jung, the personal complexes are emotionally charged clusters of ideas, memories, associations, and so on around a core element. That can be an early experience, a trauma, a strong desire, and they are in the personal unconscious. They draw in material from the personal and the collective psyche in line with archetypal patterning. They're more or less autonomous, and we register them in a physical, embodied, as well as a mental, emotional way. Daimons, on the other hand, are personifications of archetypal content in the collective unconscious. They also reflect those archetypal patterns. They have an independent, autonomous consciousness, and they're subjects in their own right, with spontaneity, purpose, and they're governed by their own laws. Kundalini is a broad, universal spiritual force that drives individuation towards a deeper connection of ego consciousness with the self, or the center and organizing principle of the psyche. So, how is this linked to trauma? Donald Kalschert has written about the archetypal self-care system, which I think is a really helpful way of understanding this. He says early trauma causes our psyche to dissociate or split off unbearable emotional pain to stop our young ego from falling apart. So the most vital, feeling, soulful parts of ourselves become hidden away from consciousness and sealed off from the outside world to keep them safe. And that's what gives rise to these deep, archetypally charged, trauma-based complexes. So the self-care system is a good thing in principle because it saved us when we were very young from falling apart, and it protects us as we go along from further wounding. But it may also restrict us and make it harder to feel fully alive. So we have these protector figures like angels who prevent the original trauma and prevent similar trauma from happening again, but they can become overly restrictive and punitive. And that's what gives rise to these terrifying persecutor figures, which it doesn't have to be figures, they can be overpowering feelings or moods or restrictive body armor. So one question I have is, might what links trauma, complexes, and daimons be a shared archetypal patterning or resonance? Might our particular wounding, and therefore our particular protector persecutor figures, and the nature of our needs and desires resonate with particular archetypally patterned diamonds. And might those complexes and diamonds mesh and interpenetrate, kind of clunk click, because of this shared resonance? If that's right, how might that work? So Jung says that diamonds attach themselves to our complexes and energetically infuse them. They kind of light them up so that we become aware of them and then can integrate them. When a complex resists or blocks a diamond's flow, that then causes a friction as the diamond is trying to push through it. And we feel that as anger, distress, or as a compulsion or a relentless drive. And Jung says we need to resolve the complex and integrate aspects of the diamond as part of the individuation process. And that gives us a sense of meaning and purpose. James Hillman, who was a Jungian or is a Jungian, says, well, let's look at that differently. We actually need our wounds and complexes because they're soul-making forces. And how we wrestle with them transforms the complex and shapes our calling and destiny. So diamonds express themselves through our wounds and complexes, which is what gives the force to individuation. It's like water needs banks to become a river. Otherwise, it's a lake or a marsh, and it doesn't move. So our task is not to resolve or get rid of our complexes, but it's to engage with them and find symbolic meaning in them. And something can emerge out of the tension between the complex and diamond. So that for me resonates with the idea of the law of three, which comes from Gurdjieff and Ouspensky. Now, I've not read either of those, but I've come across this idea through Cynthia Bourgeault. And she explains that when we're faced with a problem, we tend to think two-dimensionally in terms of the interplay of opposites like good and bad. And we try to reach a solution or a stable state by eliminating one of the poles. But the poles are implied in each other. There is syzygy, and we can't eliminate or defeat one of them to resolve the opposition. And that leaves us stuck in an endless two-dimensional cyclical pattern. But, she says, if we think in three-dimensional terms, in terms of an interplay between the two poles, and she calls them the first active and second denying force, that can produce a third mediating or reconciling force, which holds the tension between the first two. And out of that tension, a fourth thing can then emerge, a kind of transformative leap to a new state of being, which integrates both poles at a new level. And that sets up a new opposition, a new triad, a new creative force that gives the forward movement rather than a cycle. Perhaps it's a spiral. New things arise. So I've applied this to the idea of complexes and diamonds. So this little diagram is mine. It's not Bourgeault's, and it may be wrong. But I've taken the diamond to be the active force and the complex, the denying force. So the complex is blocking the flow of numinous archetypal energy personified in the diamond. And that can be an opportunity for insight. So we shouldn't try to resolve the complex away, because the diamond actually needs the complex or our body to channel the energy and consciousness coming through. And that is what gives rise to the third force and fourth element arising, perhaps a new insight or motivation that gives meaning and purpose to our lives. And Jung describes this energetic shift as well as the transcendent function, which is the movement beyond the tension between opposite to create a new third possibility, a synthesis or symbol that we hadn't seen before. So if the opposition between daimon and complex gives rise to this transcendent function or third force engagement and shift, might we be able to experience that flow physically as kundalini? Christopher Beisch, who has written extensively about very high dose LSD sessions and his learnings from that, says that complexes are lodged in the chakras, and kundalini can activate the chakras, and that exposes and engages the complexes to give a sense of the numinous, these ecstatic energies, insights, and experiences. Dana Swain, a Jungian therapist who has personal experience of kundalini, says that kundalini is a connection between ego and self, present in the physical body as somatic phenomena, in the psyche as image and feeling, and on a transpersonal level as numinous experience that results in psychological change. So we're nearing the end of this theory bit. Jung talks about pleroma and abraxas. I suspect that's beyond most of our understanding. Certainly it's beyond my own. But he says the pleroma is undifferentiated, still pure potential for being and nothingness. So kind of like source before anything happens. And then abraxas is the manifest expression of the pleroma, a numinous force that's creative and destructive, a bit like the totality of Shiva and Shakti. It embraces all opposites. So my question is, might the diamond complex pair work in a protective and mediating way? So this picture is, it came out of a high dose psilocybin session that I did, which I'll say a bit more about in a minute. It seems to me perhaps most humans are not able to tolerate direct experience of abraxas. And maybe the diamonds function as shields and energetic transformers or mediators, downstepping energy between abraxas and humans. And in that way, maybe diamonds humanize or personalize ineffable archetypal energy, so it can impact us in a way we can endure and integrate. If particular complexes resonate and mesh with specific diamonds, might that be why we can feel taken over by those particular diamonds as archetypal energy streams through? And how we engage with those transpersonal universal forces, personalized as our diamond complex pairs, might then be part of our individuation and drive us towards our calling or destiny. And that seems to fit with my experience. So how does this theory help understand our own experiences? Is it useful? I'll give 4 very short examples of diamonds in medicine journeys and then 3 in Kundalini experiences. So this first journey in 99 was what gave rise to that diagram that I gave in a minute ago. So I experienced myself as a disembodied consciousness contained and supported in existence by an infinite being, an energy field of consciousness, love, light, wisdom, and infinite compassion. I was a reflection of thought in what seemed like a vast mind. And later on in the journey, I saw Christ as a much larger thought form than me, perhaps a diamond, but also reflecting and supported by and contained within that field and consciousness. And I could dialogue with this consciousness through Christ as through a portal. And he was one of many such portals. Buddha, Mohammed, and so on, all beings of immense love, light, and power, but also reflections, thoughts within that greater field. And Christ seemed to function as a transformer or bridge between infinite being and my small self. I'm not saying that this is the truth. This is just my experience as it came through in my understanding, which of course is limited. So this was a more perhaps more physical experience in a journey in 2023. So I was flooded with increasingly strong waves of energy and my body was moved into certain positions. It seemed like to help me open to and bear that energy. I felt taken over by a divine feminine being, shielding me from the brightness of what seemed to be a masculine source behind the light. That was my intention for the journey. I asked to be shown the source behind the light. A number of times I was seized completely, feeling energy pour through me. And I say me, but really it didn't involve me at all. I was just incidental, a channel for this to happen. And the force of that energy was both terrifying and ecstatic. So this was last year, a more mental journey. But again, I can't really separate these two out. It seemed to be a more experienced more mentally and emotionally. Waves of light and color, intense pain and grief, and a sense of huge collective suffering, which I was asked to witness, but perhaps we all are. The divine, in this case, the presence felt more masculine, and I was drawn into co-creating, or perhaps it was creating through me, the most exquisite architecture of light and energy, temples and cathedrals of light and energy. So each of these experiences involved an infinitely powerful unseen source, a numinous channeling, mediating and shielding presence between me and humans in general and the source, being held in and moved by vast force, my small self being in total awe, unable to will anything other than total surrender and service, and the numinous or divine having both masculine and feminine qualities. The first and third experience, I felt more an active part of what was happening. And the first one felt deeply personal. I felt totally known, accepted, and loved. The second experience, I felt like I was just the occasion for what was happening. My witnessing self was off to the side somewhere, and all I could do was consent and surrender to what was happening. Now, I wanted to share a darker experience as well. This was an experience with ayahuasca in a Santo Daime work in 98. It was a darker experience, but I think it still had the similar dynamic. I felt like I was being taken over by a numinous entity, and I was beyond terrified. I was, yeah. It entered in different ways, contorting my face and body and engulfing me, strangling me. I had a pain in my heart. I was choking. I felt like it would push out my soul and kill me to get my body. And inwardly, I was told I should accept it. But I was too afraid to do that. I couldn't do it. I realized I might be projecting out, that this could be part of my shadow, but it also felt outside of me and evil, or at least incredibly dangerous, and like it wasn't a projection, or not only a projection. So I just resisted and had to wait for the medicine to wear off, and eventually, of course, it did. So I will now give 3 examples of diamonds as powerful attractors in Kundalini journeys. So in general, my times with the energy are a bit like holotropic breath work or spontaneous active imagination. Active imagination is Jung's technique or practice for working with material from deep psyche. So besides the physical experiences, strange thoughts or experiences emerge, and they seem powerfully true and meaningful while I'm in them. But I also have my observer consciousness there, and I know I'm in an altered state, and I can come out of it when I need to. If somebody rings the doorbell, I can go in and deal with it. So this was I've put it for one date, but it was notes from a series of different nights in 2007, where I was powerfully drawn to embodying an energy or presence. And I asked for it to replace my core and to let me merge, which each time I asked that, there is a strong energetic response. It's exhausting, very intense. There is a consistent, strong inner sense of presence. I ask for it to align me with it, for that state to become permanent, for help to adjust to it. And I will give anything for this to happen. And I agree in these experiences to what feels like a Faustian pact to be shown the truth about existence. Now, usually these experiences don't spill out over into my daytime consciousness, but this series did, and I was really frightened in my waking consciousness that I really signed my soul away, and it was only reading about Jung's shadow that helped me let go of that fear. The energy responds to my complete abandon to the process. I have to just trust and give myself over. So I assume my narrative of this and other experiences is just my mind trying to make sense of something that it can't actually understand. This is a more physical series of experiences, an ecstatic sense of energy, me and an energetic presence drinking from one another. I ask to be changed. I feel that I'm being joined at the front of my body as though zipped up along my chakras. The presence or energy enters through the chakras. I feel myself flowing into it, and there is a sense of mutual feeding, mutual flow and exchange, abandonment and merger. And there is a sense of very deep connection, and I ask for it to feast on me and to make me drink, to seal a bond or a contract. And I feel utterly repulsed and guilty as I'm gorging at the throat of another, but it feels necessary somehow. And then I'm feeding through the whole of my being. And these experiences seem aligned with stories of vampires. And I wonder whether those stories are based on this kind of experience. Or maybe I was just trying to conceptualize the experience with reference to myth. So this is the final kundalini experience, which was more mental. Again, a similar giving myself over, asking to be altered, but I'm being made part of a hive mind, a bit like the Borg. And I'm held in wave after wave of energy, bathing in bliss. I feel that this is what I am. I feel taken, I'm part of another being, a larger being, another reality. I feel altered, experimented on by others, taken over, and joined to this hive. So all these experiences seem to have common components of being taken over, of being fundamentally changed, and of being joined with something bigger than me that expresses itself through me. They all involve physical and mental aspects, an intense feeling. So they're head and heart based ways of knowing. So maybe theory did offer a framework for understanding at some level. Maybe the early trauma gave rise to terrifying figures and those psychic attacks, and their reflections of complex diamond pairs formed by Kalshed's self-care system. Maybe the practices I've engaged in have increased my archetypal penetrance, which is a term that Tim Reed has developed as indicating the degree of permeability of our ego boundary to archetypal content coming into consciousness. So maybe that, together with spiritual yearning, increased the connection and flow between my complexes and diamonds and gave rise to these kundalini-like energies. Maybe I have a transference towards my sense of energy and the presence, and my longing for connection through merger or being accepted and held in a loving presence is just a higher octave of my childhood longing for absent parents. And maybe my anxious attachment to this process and longing to surrender and allowing myself to be adapted and used, again, is a higher octave of trying to earn my parents' love by meeting their needs and expectations. But I don't think it's all that it is. So are there dangers in opening up to these forces? Claudio Naranjo writes about meditation, psychedelics, and other practices as kundalini activators. Because he says they relax ego control and body armor, which is what gives rise to non-ordinary states of consciousness and opens us up to these wider and deeper levels of awareness. And so there are a range of challenges, like ontological shock. If you mostly see the world through a materialist lens, then encountering the reality and force of the psyche through unfamiliar ways of knowing can completely throw you. And you may have to dismantle and rebuild your entire sense of reality and of who you are. And of course, facing the shadow is really hard. Those persecutor figures are there for a reason. They're blocking you from being aware of something that was too painful to acknowledge. And we're stirring deep archetypal waters. Our ego consciousness can be flooded by these numinous energies we tap into, or maybe they even tap into us. And we can be seized and drawn in by this power. And we surrender in awe and terror or rapture. Jung talks about this Dionysian intense call to journey and surrender as a call to the self, which is part of the normal individuation process. But it may take us out faster and further than we can hold or integrate, like a riptide into a field of archetypal gravitational pull. And there is the potential of experiencing what Jung calls a divine madness. And we might find that there is something autonomous beyond our ego that is real and wants to engage and express itself through us, which again can be terrifying. And the psyche has a dark dimension. Destructive forces are intrinsically part of the collective unconscious and of human nature. So diamonds have a light and a dark face. And such experiences can be terrifying, confusing, and disorientating. And they can trigger a powerful process. Jung writes about that in his Red Book, and Stan and Christina Groff have written about spiritual emergency. Jung himself was afraid that he would get lost in some kind of psychotic process. He writes, to the superficial observer, the Red Book will appear like madness. It would also have developed into one had I not been able to absorb the overpowering force of the original experiences. And Paul Tillich adds a sort of more existential viewpoint. He says we mostly live closed off to the fullness and contradictions of being and hide behind false certainties and a restrictive sense of self. To have that torn away by a sudden opening to our depths can trigger existential fear and anxiety, a sense of our contingency and our inevitable death, a loss of meaning and of emptiness in the context of what we saw, and a deep sense of guilt as we inevitably fall short of living the full potential of what we could be. So we need to tread carefully. Entering into states of expanded awareness can be healing and transformative because we individuate and become more uniquely ourselves, and because our ego becomes connected and more in service to something larger than itself. But such processes can really throw us off balance, and once triggered, their impact can continue long after the end of a workshop or retreat. So we need social containers for these experiences, ecosystems for support. So I'm coming to the end of my talk, but before I go into the last section, I want to just quickly recap where we've got to. So far, we've looked at things from the individual end. We touched on ideas about kundalini and the individuation process, the need to balance masculine and feminine ways of knowing, Jung's notion of complexes and daimons, and Kalschit's thoughts on how trauma can give rise to protector and persecutor figures. We wondered whether our complexes and transpersonal daimons might mesh because of having a similar trauma-linked archetypal resonance or signature, and also whether a complex diamond pair might function as an energetic channel, which can be mentally or physically experienced, or even a shield and energetic transformer to protect us from the full numinous power of Abraxas, and whether the energetic information flow through complex diamond pairs might reflect the shift triggered by the transcendent function, or the third force and fourth arising, and whether that can be experienced physically as kundalini. So what about the collective? Our Western culture has become very one-sided. It has a rational, materialist, consumerist worldview, and it devalues the archetypal feminine and feminine ways of knowing. Now, we know that social groups, cultures, and societies can carry trauma, and parts of a group's awareness are repressed and collective complexes form in its group field. Maybe the increasing polarities in our world and the unraveling and political shifts that we're seeing and our collective distress are symptoms of archetypal energies pushing through the blocks of our collective complexes to restore a balance. So my question is, could the increase in reports of Kundalini-like experiences be a sign of an activation of this transcendent function or third force and flow of a fourth thing arising? Could our collective complexes also resonate and pair with specific diamonds so that archetypal energy flows erupt into collective awareness? And are these a sign of diamonds expressing themselves through the collective? And that gives a risk of what Jung calls psychic epidemics, when societies are seized by mass movements because of these unconscious energies. But also, it could give an opportunity for greater awareness of what was repressed, so that it can be integrated into a more balanced culture, which includes feminine ways of knowing and relating. So, although Jung writes about the collective and what's happening in society, he comes at it from the individual end. He says we need to take responsibility for our own individuation as an answer to what's going on. If we can actively engage with the unconscious and embrace the contradictions in our nature rather than disowning and projecting them, we can genuinely see and engage with the other people, nature, the self, and resist losing ourselves in a kind of groupthink and destructive psychic epidemics, looking to leaders, movements, or ideologies to save us. We can live more self-reflectively, true to ourselves and in relationship to the self. And that is what decides whether, as they break through, these forces destroy us or bring renewal and growth. Now, there is a more systemic way of looking at this as well. Cynthia Bourgeault suggests that we're moving from a disintegrating mental rational way of thinking, which is our main Western view, to an emerging new way of thinking. So our current way of thinking sees the collective as a collection or aggregate of individuals, and the individual boundaried ego as the functioning unit of consciousness. When we think of consciousness, we think of what happens in our mind, in our personal thought. The information flow is from the part, the individual, to the whole, and the focus of this way of thinking is on individual rights. The new way of thinking, which she says is emerging, is in that thinking, the functioning unit of consciousness is an interpenetrating, diffused witnessing self. And the flow of information is from the whole to the part, as well as from the individual to the whole. And the focus is on the common good. So the common good, systems can develop their own intelligence. That's the witnessing self. It comes out of a reciprocal flow of information between the whole and the parts. The greater the number, complexity, and diversity of relationships, the greater the information flow and the brighter the consciousness. So the common good is an emergent property. It comes from a systemic wisdom that emerges fluidly and changes constantly with the situation. It's all the time, it's recalibrating itself out of this intelligent, flexible listening to changes within the system as a whole, on the part of that diffused witnessing self. So the third force or shift that we're making is the leap from a focus on individual rights to a focus on a common good, or I guess a balance in both. And ultimately, if the individual is aligned with the collective, then the two are compatible. So individuals can register the common good holographically, because the whole in a hologram is reflected in all its parts. So being in touch with that, with the common good, is what gives a sense of coherence and well-being. And we need to trust enough to open ourselves to the depths of the psyche and listen. And politically, it means that we need to listen to the inner knowingness that emerges in individuals through their resonance holographically with the knowingness in the system. So we need to somehow find a way to mine that inner knowingness. Erwin Laszlo says something similar. He speaks of the Akashic field, which is a very old concept. It's a universal, subtle, dynamic, formative, non-local cosmic information field. And the systemic intelligence and self-organizing wisdom embedded in it is what gives an evolutionary movement in existence towards wholeness, consciousness, resonance, and coherence. And because smaller complex systems like us holographically contain all the information about the entire field, we can tune into that intuitively by stilling our mind and entering expanded or non-ordinary states of consciousness. And that gives us direct experience of how everything is connected and a deep knowledge for how humanity should live. And that sounds very similar to Bourdieu's common good. And it does seem that more people are opening up to non-ordinary states and experiences, but our Western culture simply has no container for that. It has no words to think about these experiences and to share them, and it doesn't welcome them as part of normal human experience. So we need to widen what's called the Overton window in this respect. The Overton window is what can be freely shared and talked about in mainstream society. So this is my last slide and my final set of questions. If humanity is stuck between competing polarities, can we, through deep listening, experience Jung's transcendent function and the third force process, and sense something pushing towards new meaning, new emerging? Could the apparent increase in the experience of Kundalini-like phenomena be an embodied sensing of this new emergence in different culturally specific ways. Physically as forms of energy flow and kundalini, mentally as new insights, downloads, symbols and solutions, and deep feelings as well, and relationally as tuning into our diamonds as emissaries from deep psyche and the collective unconscious. And when we listen, does something listen back with which we can co-create a better future? And I would love to hear what your thoughts are on this in the discussion afterwards. I'll just flick through the next few slides just to give the references so that they're part of the recording. Okay, that's me done.
Wow, Jeanette. Sorry, is my sound okay, or do I need to move? I've got
Yes,
three
no,
parts.
you sound
Good.
good.
Good. That was absolute tour de force. I'm really quite taken aback by the depth, and look at all the emojis coming up, and the way that you've been able to share these deep formative experiences that then can resonate with our own journeys, because by sharing your journey, you're shedding light on on all of us, I think. And I think the one way of framing what's happening at the moment, and I'd be interested if we've got an astrologer on the call for a comment on what's happening, because I know that the energies are incredibly strong at the moment. And I personally listen to Pam Gregory, and I think she's got a lot of interesting things to say, and she's giving very regular updates in her rather reassuring way, and which is also to do with this breakthrough of consciousness, which you've been talking about in terms of the common good and the relationship to something larger than ourselves. And it seems like there's a kind of, we're talking about a continuum here, and we're actually in all parts on all parts of the continuum, but we maybe identify with a particular part, or a complex, or something which has a sense of separation. But in fact, none of this energetically is is separate. It's all in the flow, as I think you very eloquently expressed. And I think yes, this initiation, in the 80s, Michael Grosso, who's a member, was talking about the planetary NDE, and so was Ken Ring in his Heading Toward Omega, which is his book from 1988. And I think you've given a very strong sense of death and rebirth, of breakdown and breakthrough, and the evolutionary drive towards wholeness. And what we're seeing now is an unprecedented degree of division and polarization. Some of which is I think orchestrated to keep us in a permanent state of anxiety. Which it's quite easy to fall into that. And I think it's also energetically, you imply that there's a deep longing here. There's a deep longing for wholeness, and there's a desire for integration, because in a way that's who we essentially are. But the expression, the kind of split off, the dissociated alter, has to realize that, and then allow the expansion to take place. So I mean, it's just so rich. Those are just a few observations. But can I ask you about the art? and the illustration.
Ted Wallace.
Sorry?
Sorry. Yeah, Ted Wallace is the artist.
Right.
I've put his website on the first slide. So if
Okay.
people, it's amazing the work that this man does. He's a visionary artist. I think he's a Buddhist, and he's gone so deep within himself. And he very generously allows me to use his images for my presentations. Yeah, a wonderful man.
Well, you can see the interplay